Ever wonder what happened when the king tried to step outside his comfort zone? Did Elvis Presley really attempt to conquer every musical genre imaginable? The answer might surprise you. While Elvis is remembered for his rock and roll, swagger, gospel passion, and ballad mastery, his lesser-known musical experiments reveal a restless artist constantly pushing boundaries. Not every creative risk paid off, but they showcase an Elvis few fans truly know. Number 7. Elvis's secret disco album, Presley's Dance Floor. Was Elvis about to trade his blue suede shoes for platform boots? In late 1976, as disco fever swept America, Elvis's management saw an opportunity. With artists like Donna Summer and the Bee Gees dominating charts, Colonel Tom Parker suggested Elvis record a full disco album titled Presley's Dance Floor. RCA executives were thrilled at the commercial potential. Elvis, always musically curious despite his declining health, agreed to experiment in the studio. In December 1976, he booked several late-night sessions with a group of session musicians familiar with the disco sound. They laid down basic tracks for 6 songs, including Strobe Light Romance and Boogie All Night Long. Elvis recorded vocal tracks for 4 songs before the project was abandoned. Producers attempted to incorporate disco's signature, driving bass lines and 4-on-the-floor beats while maintaining Elvis's rock sensibility. The resulting tracks featured Elvis trying to adapt his distinctive vocal style to repetitive dance grooves. According to sound engineer Mike Moran, who worked on the sessions, Elvis gave it his all, but his heart wasn't really in it. He'd do a take, listen back, and just shake his head. He kept saying it wasn't him. The few people who heard the recordings described them as awkward mashups. Elvis's powerful vocals seemed constrained by disco's formulaic structure. By February 1977, with only 4 partial tracks completed, Elvis pulled the plug on the project. None of the recordings have ever been officially released, though bootleg collectors claim to have snippets of the sessions. In a rare 1977 interview, Elvis briefly mentioned the aborted disco project. "I appreciate all kinds of music, but some things just don't fit. You gotta know when something isn't working." Just months later, Elvis passed away, leaving the disco experiment as one of his final studio endeavors. Number 6. Elvis's foray into progressive rock, the Memphis Odyssey. Could Elvis have become the king of prog rock? Few fans know that in 1969, fresh from his successful TV comeback special, Elvis briefly considered creating a concept album inspired by the emerging progressive rock movement. Bands like King Crimson and Yes were beginning to gain attention with their complex compositions and philosophical themes. Elvis, always more musically adventurous than his critics acknowledged, spent 2 weeks listening extensively to early progressive rock albums. According to his friend and Memphis Mafia member Jerry Schilling, Elvis would sit for hours with headphones on, listening to these new bands with all their weird time signatures and long instrumental breaks. In March 1969, Elvis invited several session musicians to his Graceland home to experiment with what he called something different. He outlined an ambitious concept album titled The Memphis Odyssey, a semi-autobiographical musical journey that would incorporate elements of classical music, jazz, and rock across 4 extended tracks. The musicians spent 3 days jamming in Elvis's home studio, with Elvis attempting to write lyrics that departed from his usual themes. According to bassist Norbert Putnam, who participated in these sessions, Elvis started talking about wanting 7-minute songs with instrumental breaks and tempo changes. He was particularly interested in incorporating mellotron and Hammond organ sounds to create something atmospheric. The experiment quickly revealed fundamental challenges. Elvis struggled with the complex song structures and abstract lyrical concepts central to progressive rock. His songwriting strength had always been emotional directness, not the literary and philosophical narratives common in prog rock. After 3 days, Elvis abruptly ended the sessions. "I think he realized his strengths lay elsewhere," Putnam recalled. "He just looked at us and said, 'Boys, I think we're overthinking this. Let's save these ideas for another time.'" Elvis never returned to these progressive rock concepts, instead channeling his creative energy into the more rootsy sound that would define his early 1970s recordings. No recordings from these experimental sessions have surfaced, leaving fans to wonder what an Elvis progressive rock album might have sounded like. Some biographers suggest the experience wasn't entirely fruitless. Elements of the expansive arrangement ideas appeared in later tracks like An American Trebrion, which featured more complex orchestration than typical Elvis recordings. Number 5, Elvis's unreleased spoken word poetry album, Midnight Thoughts. Did the King almost become a beat poet? In 1965, while filming in Hollywood during his movie contract period, Elvis developed an interest in poetry and spoken word performances. This coincided with the growing beat poetry movement and the emergence of artists like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac into mainstream awareness. According to Elvis's longtime friend Lamar Fike, Elvis began writing poetry during night shooting breaks. He'd be sitting there between scenes scribbling these poems about life, loneliness, fame, all that stuff he was feeling but couldn't express in the movies he was making, Fike recalled in a 1997 interview. By summer 1965, Elvis had accumulated dozens of poems and approached Colonel Parker about recording them as a spoken word album with minimal musical accompaniment. Parker was immediately skeptical about the commercial viability, but reluctantly arranged a single recording session at RCA's Hollywood studios in August 1965. Elvis arrived with a leather-bound notebook containing approximately 30 poems. The studio was set up with subtle jazz accompaniment, just bass, drums, and piano. Over 6 hours, Elvis recorded 14 poems with titles like Midnight in Memphis, Fame's Prison, and Blue Light Boulevard. Sound engineer Al Pachucki recalled the session. "It was unlike anything I'd seen him do before. He dimmed the lights, sat on a stool, and just poured his heart out through these poems. Some were angry, some were sad, some were surprisingly funny, but all of them were honest in a way his movie songs at that time weren't." The recordings revealed a contemplative side of Elvis, rarely seen in his public persona. His deep voice, with its natural rhythm and emotion, suited the spoken word format surprisingly well. The jazz trio improvised subtle accompaniment behind Elvis's recitations, creating an atmospheric backing that complemented, but never overpowered his words. When Colonel Parker heard the recordings days later, he reportedly declared them commercial suicide and immediately shelved the project. Elvis didn't fight the decision, perhaps knowing the recordings were too personal and too far removed from his public image to be released. The master tapes of Midnight Thoughts, as the album was tentatively titled, were placed in RCA's vault. After Elvis's death, several archivists confirmed the existence of these recordings, but they've never been released or included in any official retrospective collections. The few RCA employees who heard the recordings described them as surprisingly moving and showing a depth most people never saw in Elvis. According to Elvis historian Ernst Jorgensen, who has cataloged virtually all of Elvis's recordings, the spoken word sessions remain one of the most intriguing unreleased projects in the Presley catalog. They reveal an artist eager to express himself beyond the constraints of his established persona. Number 4. Elvis's brief jazz fusion experiment. Blue Note Presley. Ever wondered if Elvis could swing with the jazz cats? In early 1972, as jazz fusion was gaining popularity through artists like Miles Davis and Weather Report, Elvis expressed curiosity about incorporating jazz elements into his sound. According to several musicians present during this period, Elvis spent several evenings listening to contemporary jazz albums, particularly impressed by the technical musicianship. Elvis's interest in jazz wasn't entirely new. He had always appreciated the genre and occasionally incorporated jazz-influenced piano or horn arrangements in his recordings. However, in February 1972, between concert tours, he decided to explore a more explicit jazz fusion project. Elvis booked 3 days at American Sound Studio in Memphis and assembled an unusual group of musicians, his regular rhythm section supplemented by 3 accomplished jazz players from New York. The goal was to record an EP tentatively titled Blue Note Presley, featuring jazz rock arrangements of both new material and reinterpretations of Elvis classics. Guitarist James Burton, a regular member of Elvis's band, recalled the session. Elvis came in with these charts that had all these weird chord progressions and time signatures. None of us regulars knew quite what to make of it, but the jazz guys were nodding along like it made perfect sense. The sessions began enthusiastically, with Elvis attempting to adapt his vocal approach to match the complex musical backdrop. The group recorded instrumental tracks for 5 songs, including a jazz fusion version of Suspicious Minds featuring extended improvisational sections and an original composition called Memphis Sunset, written specifically for the project. However, tensions emerged as the sessions progressed. Elvis struggled with the improvisational nature of jazz fusion, where vocalists often treat their voice as another instrument rather than the central focus. His strengths as a vocalist, emotional interpretation, and rhythmic precision didn't easily translate to the genre's technical demands. By the 3rd day, Elvis's initial enthusiasm had faded. After listening to rough mixes, he concluded that the experiment wasn't working. According to studio engineer Glenn Spreen, Elvis just said, "I appreciate what you cats are doing, but this isn't me. I'm trying to be something I'm not." The jazz fusion project was immediately shelved, with none of the material completed or released. The instrumental tracks reportedly remained in American Sound Studio's archive until the studio closed in 1975. After which their whereabouts became unknown. The only evidence of this brief experimental period is in session logs and the recollections of the musicians involved. Music historian Peter Grolnick noted that while the jazz fusion experiment didn't yield released material, it demonstrated Elvis's continuous musical curiosity, even in the 1970s, when many critics accused him of creative stagnation. Number 3. Elvis's abandoned electronic music project with synthesizer pioneer Robert Moog. Could Elvis have pioneered electronic pop? In an almost forgotten chapter of music history, Elvis briefly collaborated with synthesizer inventor Robert Moog in 1968. As electronic instruments began appearing in popular music, Elvis became intrigued by their potential after hearing the Moog synthesizer on albums by the Monkees and the Doors. According to Moog's personal papers, archive at Cornell University, Elvis's management contacted him in spring 1968 about a potential collaboration. Moog, already famous for his revolutionary synthesizer, was surprised by Elvis's interest, but agreed to bring his equipment to a special session in Los Angeles. The meeting took place in June 1968, shortly before Elvis began filming his comeback television special. Moog arrived with an early version of his synthesizer, setting it up in a private studio Elvis had booked for experimentation rather than formal recording. For 2 days, Elvis and Moog worked together, exploring the synthesizer's capabilities. Elvis was particularly fascinated by the instrument's ability to create entirely new sounds rather than emulate existing instruments. According to Moog's notes, Elvis quickly grasped the synthesizer's potential, asking intelligent questions about how electronic sounds might complement his vocal style. The duo sketched ideas for 3 songs that would blend Elvis's vocals with electronic soundscapes, something radically different from his established sound. One concept, titled Future Shock, envisioned Elvis singing over pulsing electronic rhythms and atmospheric synthesizer pads, creating what would have been a revolutionary fusion of rock vocals and electronic music. Elvis's regular pianist, Glenn D. Hardin, who observed part of the session, later recalled, "Elvis was absolutely captivated by those weird electronic sounds. He kept saying, 'This is the future, boys. We need to get ahead of this.'" However, Elvis's management, particularly Colonel Tom Parker, saw the electronic experiment as a dangerous diversion from the comeback strategy they had carefully planned. When Parker heard about the sessions, he immediately expressed concern about alienating Elvis's core audience. According to Moog's correspondence, Parker called him directly, saying, "Mr. Moog, your machines are mighty interesting, but Elvis needs to be Elvis right now." Under pressure from Parker, and with the television special preparation becoming the priority, Elvis reluctantly abandoned the electronic music project. No completed recordings emerged from the sessions, though Moog mentioned in a 1978 interview that they had created rough demos that Elvis had taken with him. Music technology historian Trevor Pinch considers the abandoned collaboration one of music's great what-if moments. Had Elvis embraced electronic music in 1968, it might have completely changed, developing primarily through progressive rock and later disco. We might have seen an entirely different debut primarily through progressive revelry than action artists. Number 2. Elvis's country psychedelic fusion, Desert Mind. Was Elvis planning to go psychedelic? In late 1967, as psychedelic music revolutionized the rock landscape through albums like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and The Doors, Elvis began showing interest in the new sound. While filming the movie Stay Away Joe in Arizona, Elvis became fascinated by the desert landscape and the emerging psychedelic scene. According to Elvis's friend and jocker Red West, Elvis spent several evenings listening to Jefferson Airplane and early Pink Floyd records. Elvis was really intrigued by the studio effects, the backwards guitars, the facing, all that stuff, West recalled in his memoir. He kept saying there was a way to combine this with his country roots to create something new. During breaks in filming, Elvis worked with guitarist Charlie McCoy and drummer DJ Fontana on experimental song ideas. The concept evolved into what Elvis called a country psychedelic sound, traditional country instrumentation processed through psychedelic effects, with lyrics inspired by Native American imagery and desert visions. In January 1968, Elvis booked 2 nights at a small Phoenix recording studio to develop these ideas into a cohesive project he tentatively called Desert Mind. The sessions were kept secret from Colonel Parker and RCA, with Elvis personally paying for the studio time. Over 2 nights, Elvis and a small group of musicians recorded basic tracks for 7 songs, including titles like Peyote, Sunrise, Mesa, Dreams, and Turquoise Sky. The recordings blended country instrumentation with primitive psychedelic effects, tape delays on Elvis's vocals, backward guitar solos, and unusual percussion instruments borrowed from Native American traditions. Sound engineer Thomas Drake, who worked the sessions, described the music as unlike anything I expected from Elvis. The songs had these hypnotic, repetitive structures with Elvis chanting more than singing in parts. Then it would shift into these gorgeous country melodies before going experimental again. Elvis planned to complete the album privately and then present it to RCA as a finished project, hoping its uniqueness would overcome their certain reluctance. However, when he returned to Los Angeles and played the rough mixes for a few trusted friends, the reaction was mixed. Some saw it as brilliant innovation. Others worried it would alienate his core audience. As Elvis became immersed in preparations for his 1968 comeback special, the Desert Mind project lost momentum. By March 1968, he had set it aside, telling Red West, "Maybe the world's not ready for this side of me yet." The recordings were never completed or released. According to several Elvis historians, the Desert Mind tapes were stored at Graceland, but haven't been located in any subsequent cataloging of Elvis's personal recordings. Whether they still exist remains unknown. Music critic Grail Marcus, who has researched lost recordings from this period, suggests the project represents Elvis's most experimental impulse, a road not taken that might have reinvented his artistic identity in ways we can barely imagine. Number 1. Elvis's classical crossover album. Presley conducts the classics. Did the king nearly trade his microphone for a conductor's baton? In 1972, at the height of his comeback success, Elvis began expressing interest in classical music. According to members of his inner circle, he spent many evenings at Graceland, listening to recordings of Beethoven, Puccini, and particularly Tchaikovsky, whose emotional melodies resonated with him. Elvis's classical interests weren't entirely surprising to those who knew him well. Throughout his career, he had incorporated classical elements into his performances, from the operatic qualities of It's Now or Never, based on O Sole Mio, to the orchestral arrangements of his ballads. However, what few fans realized was how serious his classical ambitions became. In March 1972, Elvis approached RCA with an unusual proposal, a classical crossover album tentatively titled Presley Conducts the Classics. The concept was groundbreaking. Elvis would collaborate with arranger and composer Richard Rodney Bennett to create orchestral interpretations of classical pieces, with Elvis both conducting and occasionally singing adapted lyrics set to famous classical themes. RCA executives were skeptical but intrigued by the commercial potential of Elvis entering the classical crossover market. They authorized a preliminary budget for orchestra rehearsals and arranged for Elvis to receive basic conducting lessons from Leonard Bernstein associate Charles Gerhardt. For 3 weeks, Elvis devoted himself to studying musical notation and basic conducting techniques. According to his cousin Billy Smith, Elvis threw himself into learning this stuff like I'd never seen. He had music stands set up in his bedroom, was watching films of famous conductors, and practicing his baton technique in front of mirrors. The project advanced to the planning stage, with Bennett creating arrangements of 10 classical pieces adapted for Elvis's involvement. The selections included Puccini's Nessun Dorma Barbers, Adagio for strings, and several Tchaikovsky compositions. For 3 pieces, lyrics were developed that Elvis would sing at key moments, while the remainder would be purely instrumental with Elvis conducting. In May 1972, a 40-piece orchestra was booked for preliminary rehearsals at RCA's Los Angeles studios. Elvis arrived nervous but prepared, according to orchestra members. For 2 days, he worked with the musicians, attempting to conduct Tchaikovsky's None But the Lonely Heart and a simplified arrangement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. The results revealed Elvis's musical limitations. While he had excellent natural timing and emotional understanding of the music, his lack of formal training became evident. Orchestra concertmaster David Frisina later recalled, "Elvis had incredible musical instincts, but conducting an orchestra requires years of training. He knew what he wanted the music to express, but couldn't quite communicate it technically." After the second rehearsal, Elvis met privately with RCA executives. According to those present, the conversation was difficult, but remarkably self-aware. Elvis reportedly admitted, "I'm not ready for this. Maybe with another year of study, but right now I'd be doing these composers a disservice." The classical project was abandoned before any formal recordings took place. Elvis redirected his energy toward his concert performances and more conventional recording sessions. However, elements of his classical interest emerge in the increasingly complex orchestral arrangements of his 1970s recordings, particularly on ballads like My Way and American Tree-Eyes. Music historian Colin Escott noted the classical project represented Elvis's awareness of his own limitations, combined with his refusal to stay in the box critics had created. For him, even his unfulfilled projects reveal an artist constantly seeking growth. What other musical frontiers might Elvis have explored had he lived longer? Could any of these experimental directions have revitalized his career in the late 1970s? The unfinished projects and abandoned experiments provide a tantalizing glimpse of roads not taken, adventures in sound that remind us there was much more to Elvis Presley than his undeniable achievements and tragic decline. What version of Elvis might we have discovered if he'd survived to follow his musical curiosity wherever it led?